So with that, let's go back to the phone. So again, we have an hour of open forum with Joe Heschmeyer, author of The Early Church Was the Catholic Church and Pope Peter. And the number to call is 888-318-7884. Let's go to Ricky in Nebraska. Ricky is with us through EWTN. Go ahead, Ricky. What's your question for Joe Heschmeyer?
Hey guys, thanks for taking my call, Joe.
Yeah.
I'm glad I called on a night when you were speaking, because I just recently finished Pope Peter and The Early Church Was the Catholic Church, and
wonderful.
Honestly, they both frustrated the heck out of me. So, in a good way, but also just in a way that made me uncomfortable, because I'm not a Catholic, so I read your book.
Okay, I see.
Trying to learn more.
That's an important detail when you say they really frustrate you. If you were like a Catholic who's like, man, this book really threatens my Catholic faith, that's a very different kind of read of the book. Sorry, go ahead, Ricky.
No, it's quite you're okay. It's quite the opposite, actually. It threatened my non-Catholic faith, but. But I wanted to ask you a question, and it actually relates to a dialogue that you had with Gavin Ortlund back, I think, actually now like 2021, when you had the dialogue with him on the papacy. And Gavin made a claim about the Pope at one time having military jurisdiction or military power. He didn't really qualify it. He just kind of threw it out there. I'm assuming that he made that on, he knew what he was talking about, so I just kind of take it on good faith. But the question I want to ask you is, why is that actually true? Has there been popes that have had military jurisdiction? And how does that kind of reconcile with the idea of Peter, put your sword away, those who live by the sword die by the sword? Like, how does that I'm struggling with that a little bit, just because it seems like, okay, if there is a papal office, where do we get this idea that he's going to have military power?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a very good question. I'm going to do my best to give a kind of clear answer to it. There have been popes in the past who have, certainly, I'd say you've got the Swiss Guard even today, right? Like, there are people with weapons who protect the Pope. And so that's not new, and that I think it probably makes sense just from the perspective of being a world leader, especially since there have been multiple assassination attempts. Twice Pope John Paul II suffered assassination attempts, once very famously and once less famously. And so it makes sense to protect the Pope in some way. And under kind of similar reasoning, what was then called the Papal States, the area of land around Rome, was under the Pope's direct kind of jurisdiction. This was at a time when a lot of what we now call Italy was a series of fighting like city-states. So places that are now part of the same state, like Umbria and Assisi, they're like half an hour away from each other. They both had an army, and they would go to war with one another. And so in that context, after the Roman Empire collapsed in the West, it fell to the Pope to protect the city of Rome, because no one else was doing it. And the papacy was the centralized authority that existed on the ground. And so everything from care for the poor to protecting the city from barbarians really fell in the hands of the Pope. So it happens, I would say, more by historical accident than anything else. Because otherwise, when the barbarians come in to rape and pillage, there's just nobody else there to protect the city. And so there are these incredible stories of, the Catholic Church really standing up even to like Attila the Hun. Now there it wasn't through weapons, but the Pope did go out and had some kind of encounter with him, and Attila the Hun turned back without attacking the city. That there was a seemingly miraculous kind of intervention. So these things, there's a long and strange history. It's easy now when we think about the relative peace in Europe, to think, well, how would you need a military? How would you need any of these things? But at the time, it was, I think, largely a matter of survival. Now, there were popes who leaned into that too much. So Pope Julius II was known the warrior pope because he was only too happy to wield secular power. And so the church, where we fell on it is like this. Self-defense is not wrong. Military service is not wrong. But priests shouldn't be directly involved in the fighting. And so right now, like, you have chaplains and that sort of thing, but you don't have popes leading armies. Julius II was a strange exception to this. and was, I think, pretty roundly condemned even by other Catholics in his day for kind of his involvement in these temporal affairs. Does that, I don't know, does that help? I'm trying to give you 2,000 years worth of kind of papal history here, and I think I'm doing a very kind of abbreviated job.
No, it does. And I'm actually about to start. I have Patrick Madrid's Pope Fiction, and he's got some chapters, I think, in that book on that. I was wondering if I could follow up just real quick with something then. I don't know if you can officially answer it, but
sure.
Would I don't even know how to phrase this. Could I become a Catholic and still reject just war theory?
Oh, okay. That's a really good question. Parts of let's delve a couple things in here. I want to just be clear because you didn't ask this directly, but because related to the last thing. You can be a Catholic and think that the popes were in the wrong for the way they conducted their power or that they used their power badly. You can be a Catholic and have different views of the proper relationship between church and state within a very broad kind of umbrella. And over the course of history, there have been competing Catholic views on how church and state ought to interact, what's sometimes called the two swords doctrine. And so all of it, very much this question of living by the sword, dying by the sword. How do we live that out at a national level? What's the church's role in all of that? Those are very nuanced kind of questions. To my knowledge, just war theory is not a defined dogma in any sense, so it wouldn't be binding. It is, I think, still right. So I think if you were to reject it, I'd be interested in what you rejected it in favor of, because something like an outright pacifism doesn't seem to be taught by the New Testament. Nevertheless, you'll find pacifists like Dorothy Day, who's on her way towards sainthood. So it certainly seems that one could be both a Catholic and even a very holy Catholic, while, in my view, getting this area wrong.
Right. Okay.
Does that help, Ricky?
I mean, it does help. Yeah, I appreciate that. I have more to say, but I know you guys have a lot of time, so I don't want to take up from you. So I appreciate.
I would love it if you called back. I'm very excited about your journey, and I'd love to talk, a little more in depth about just war theory and why I think pacifism is actually kind of a dangerous route to go down. I would just say the danger anytime you set the moral bar too high is that then people just basically despair of ever meeting it and then behave much worse than if you set the moral bar in a actually achievable sort of place. And there's a great essay by G.E.M. Anscombe, Elizabeth Anscombe, on pacifism that I imagine you can find online, in which she makes this argument a lot more cogently than I can, given kind of time reasons.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and certainly, Ricky, and I would just say, Ricky, and anybody else that's out there and has questions about just war theory, certainly check out Catholic.com. If you're not a regular user of Catholic.com, there is a great search bar there where you can put in any topic from just war theory to worship of Mary to venerating saints to all these different questions that you might have about the Catholic faith. So certainly we love for any of our folks to call in during the show, but maybe you've got some follow-up questions after the show, or Joe or Jimmy or whoever didn't quite answer all of the questions that you had. You can always, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, go to Catholic.com, put your question into the search bar, and you will be shocked at just how many resources come up, because Catholic Answers have been around for 40 years, and a whole bunch of that stuff is right there on Catholic.com for you to access.